I'm going to talk about what makes legacy forests, like those found in the Upper Salmon Creek timber sale, unique. This is a photograph of an old legacy cedar tree that was probably left over from the previous stand when it was logged in the early 1900s, along with some old stumps from trees that were hand cut. One of the things that makes these forests different from tree plantations that we see across much of the landscape now is the way in which they were logged. It's important to understand that there is virtually no old growth left in the Puget Sound region. These forests and many lowland watersheds are the closest thing we have to old growth, and in many ways resemble the old growth forests they replaced because of the way in which they were logged and because they were allowed to grow back on their own. When you look at photographs of old logging operations from the 1930s and 40s, it's very rare to see anything that resembles what we would refer to as a clear cut. Logging was very labor intensive back then. There were no chainsaws or logging trucks. They had to cut everything down by hand and pull the logs down the hill with steam-powered yarders, or in some cases oxen or brute manpower, and transport them to the mills by rail car. They would commonly leave a lot of stuff behind, standing dead trees, down logs, and smaller understory trees, what they referred to as trash trees. Sometimes they'd also leave seed trees behind to seed the new stand. And they really weren't doing any replanting. And so they inadvertently preserved the structural, biological, and genetic legacies of the original forests, which is why we call them legacy forests. Some may ask, why do we need to protect these trees down in the valley? We've got plenty of big trees in the Olympic National Forest. This is a photograph of an old growth forest on a hill slope on federal forest land overlooking Port Angeles that's almost all Douglas fir. So why is it important to protect stands like those found in the Upper Salmon Creek timber sale? Well, the glacial outwash plain on the northwest end of Hood Canal, which is located within the Olympic range shadow, is a distinct ecoregion, distinct from the Olympic National Forest, distinct from the Olympic National Park, both in terms of its climate, its geology, its soil chemistry, and its natural plant communities. And a majority of the remaining natural and old growth-like forests, those forests that we refer to as legacy forests in the Olympic range shadow, are on lands managed by DNR. So once these legacy forests are gone, the forests on DNR lands are gone, there's not going to be much non-industrial forest land left in East Jefferson County. If you believe what DNR's policy for sustainable forests says, that biodiversity is the fundamental guiding principle for sustainable forest management, not a fundamental principle, but the fundamental principle, then it's important to manage forests by ecoregion. That means providing suitable older forest habitat within each ecoregion to sustain the species that are dependent on that type of habitat. This is a chart from a seminal study conducted in 1985 and published by the U.S. Forest Service that is still cited, that shows the estimated number of vertebrate species present within each stand development stage. And you can see over on the right side that there are a disproportionate number of species that are dependent on older forests for breeding habitat, which is indicated by these black bars, and many other species either dependent on or associated with older forest conditions during some portion of their life cycle. So one way of looking at how these forests are distributed across Jefferson County is to map the locations of all of the larger trees. It's not perfect, but it's a good place to start. And what you can see from this map is that the vast majority of large trees in East Jefferson County are located on lands managed by DNR. And we've taken this data and combined it with other data that we've obtained from DNR to model the extents of these legacy forests, which are shown here in red. These forests are distinguished by these large trees that you find, which we've recently learned provide great habitat for all kinds of creatures, arthropods, invertebrates, fungi, lichens, and even some bird species that nest in the bark pockets of these trees. Another thing that distinguishes these forests are these large standing dead snags. These provide invaluable habitat for all kinds of birds and small mammals. You can imagine that there have been hundreds of little voles and maybe swifts and flickers or wood rats or flying squirrels or other creatures that have nested in these cavities over the years. The large trunks on these trees tend to be fire resistant, and the large gaps between the trees can function as fire breaks and reduce the fire intensity and risk of catastrophic wildfires. And large hollowed out snags like this one can provide sites for larger mammals looking to build winter dens. You'll often hear DNR say that they're not required to protect old forests. This simply isn't true. There are all kinds of provisions in their habitat conservation plan and policy for sustainable forests that require them to protect old forests. Another thing you'll hear DNR say is that they've already set aside half their land for conservation. This isn't true either. If you look at their data, it's more like 13% in the Straits. And if you look at where they are today, this is DNR's own data, they're only at about 0.6% fully functional forests in the Straits. So they've got a long way to go. You could include stream buffer strips in that calculation. Those are the buffer strips that DNR is legally required to leave along perennial and fish-bearing streams under the Forest Practices Act. But even then, it only gets you to 37% of DNR managed lands that are off limits to commercial logging. And it's pretty clear that a stream buffer strip does not constitute a fully functional old-growth forest, no matter how old it is. And if you look at how much of that 13% is as old as the forests that we find in the Upper Salmon Creek timber sale, and this includes all buffer strips, there are only about 5,000 acres that are 98 years old or older in the Straits. That's about 4% of DNR's land base. It's critical that we protect every last acre of legacy forest that we can if we're to meet the goals and objectives of the Habitat Conservation Plan and the Policy for Sustainable Forests, and help to ensure that we preserve what's left of our natural heritage.